It is quiet now. The day has ended, and the world has softened into its evening close. Perhaps you're lying in bed, or perhaps sitting somewhere still listening. And so, let us wander back. Back not to kings or crusades, not to bloody battles or gilded courts, but to cloisters, to stone abbeys with cold floors and warmer kitchens, to a place where monks, men sworn to silence and prayer, also spent long hours brewing beer. Yes, the monks, the keepers of manuscripts, the guardians of knowledge, the men who copied words letter by letter. They also knew the craft of drink, foaming mugs, wooden barrels, ale and beer flowing as steadily as prayer bells. This is the story of how monks got drunk, and how, in the quiet corners of medieval Europe, they became some of the finest brewers the world has ever known. To understand why monks brewed beer, we must first understand water. It was not always safe, not always clean. Rivers filled with waste, wells muddied. Even the rain caught in wooden tubs would sour if left too long. So people drank beer, not the strong, heavy kind we think of today, but a weaker, gentler drink, a liquid bread, sometimes called small beer. It had just enough alcohol to keep away the dangerous little creatures we now call bacteria. And so, even children drank it, even in monasteries. But monasteries were not ordinary places. They had rules, many rules. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, spoke clearly of moderation. Too much wine was frowned upon, too much indulgence was unholy. And yet, it also said that monks must be cared for. Their bodies were not to be starved or broken. So beer, being less fiery than wine, found a place at the monk's table. It was nourishment. It was medicine. It was safer than water. And it was pleasant in that small and quiet way that comforts the spirit. So when thirst came calling, the monks answered it with brewing, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Imagine a monastery in the Middle Ages, stone walls high, gardens within, cloisters echoing with footsteps. The monk's day begins before dawn with prayers muttered in the cold dark. Then comes work, endless work. Among the scribes and the gardeners were also the brewers. They would rise early to stir their kettles, to soak the grain, to let it sprout and sweeten, to dry it over fires. The smell of malt would drift through the abbey, sweet, toasty, earthy. In the great vats, hot water would be poured, turning crushed grain into a porridge like mash. It was not glamorous work. The air would be heavy with steam, the floor sticky, but it was holy work in its way, because beer was not just for the monks. It was also for the poor, for travelers, for pilgrims who arrived at the gate with tired feet and empty stomachs. Hospitality was sacred, so a monastery might serve bread, soup, and, of course, beer, not to intoxicate, but to restore. And because of this, brewing became as important as praying, a rhythm of stirring, boiling, cooling, fermenting, a rhythm that echoed through centuries. The monks did not invent beer. It had been made since the dawn of civilization. Babylonians drank it, Egyptians too. But the monks, they refined it. They kept records, recipes written in neat, careful hands. They experimented, adjusted. Where peasants brewed rough and rustic beer, monks aimed for consistency. Their beer was smoother, cleaner, better balanced, and they had secrets. One of them was hops. Before hops, beer was flavored with what was called gruit, a mix of herbs and spices. Sometimes rosemary, sometimes yarrow, sometimes heather, but gruit was unpredictable, bitter or sweet, depending on who made it, and conveniently controlled by local authorities who taxed its sale. Hops change everything, bitter, yes, but also preserving. Beer with hops lasted longer, traveled further, stayed fresh. It is said that monks were among the first in Europe to truly embrace hops, sometime around the 9th or 10th century. At first, people were suspicious. Too bitter, too strange. But the monks saw its worth, and slowly the bitter plant crept into brewing across the continent. Thus, a new taste was born, the taste of modern beer, thanks to the quiet experiments in monastery walls. Now, here's a curious thing. Monks were bound by rules of fasting. During Lent, meat was forbidden, milk too, sometimes even eggs. But beer was different. It wasn't chewed. It wasn't roasted or carved at the table. It was liquid bread, nourishment in a cup. So, during long fasts, monks could drink beer instead of eating. And drink they did. In some records, each monk was allotted several liters per day. Strong, nourishing beer. Enough to sustain the body while the soul was busy in prayer. One might say they drank themselves through Lent, not in rowdy drunkenness, but in steady, sustaining gulps. To a hungry monk, beer was salvation. Thick, heavy, filling. A loaf of bread poured into a mug. And so, as the centuries passed, monasteries became known not only for prayer and learning, but also for brewing. Their ales and beers were famous. Pilgrims sought them. Towns envied them. Even kings and bishops tasted them. But this is only the beginning, because the story of monastic brewing would not remain locked inside cloisters. It would spread, it would grow, and it would leave us, today, with a legacy still poured into glasses around the world. As monasteries brewed, their reputations grew. Travelers spoke of the fine taste of abbey beer. Merchants carried stories, and soon monasteries became little centers of brewing excellence. In towns, ordinary brewers made rougher beer, sometimes sour, sometimes spoiled. But monastic beer was different. It had care, cleanliness, consistency. The monks, bound by their rhythms of work and prayer, kept their brewing vessels clean. They measured carefully, they wrote things down. In a world where guesswork was common, this was unusual. So people began to trust monastic beer. If you were traveling, if you were uncertain, you would choose the monastery's drink, because you knew it was safer and perhaps more nourishing. In this way, monasteries gained income. They sold surplus beer to locals, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, for not all rulers approved of monks competing with town brewers. But the beer spread, and slowly the reputation of monastic brewing spread with it. Not all monks brewed the same. Different orders, different traditions. The Benedictines, one of the oldest, brewed steadily across Europe. The Cistercians, who valued simplicity and hard labor, were also known for their beer. And later, the Trappists, an offshoot of the Cistercians, would become the most famous of all. The Trappists are still with us. Even today, a few dozen monasteries carry on the tradition, brewing beers so rich and strong they are sometimes called liquid meals. Chimay, Westmalle, Orval, names whispered with reverence by lovers of beer. These monasteries kept alive a heritage that stretched back 1,000 years. A heritage born not in taverns or breweries, but in quiet kitchens behind monastery walls. It is easy to imagine monks drinking endlessly, but the story is not so simple. Much of the beer they brewed was for others, for pilgrims, for beggars, for travelers with tired feet, for hospitals run by monasteries, where beer was given as nourishment to the sick. Beer was part of charity. It was a way of caring for the community. And because monasteries were often wealthier and better supplied than surrounding villages, they could give generously. Some even had different strengths of beer: a weak, watery beer for the poor, a stronger, richer beer for the monks themselves, and the strongest of all, sometimes reserved for feast days or for selling to nobles who admired the monk's craft. So beer was layered: a drink of survival, a drink of comfort, a drink of celebration, all brewed in the same vats, just strained differently, boiled longer, or left to ferment more deeply. But as centuries passed, monasteries faced storms. The Reformation swept across Europe. Monasteries were dissolved, wealth confiscated. Many breweries fell silent. In some countries like England, monastic brewing almost disappeared. The old abbey ales were gone. Taverns and secular brewers took their place. Yet in Catholic regions, Belgium, Bavaria, parts of France, the tradition survived. Some monasteries clung tightly to their brewing, even as the world changed around them. Later, the Napoleonic Wars closed more monasteries, and yet again, some survived. Always, it seems, there were a few who kept the kettles boiling, who stirred the mash, who poured the foaming beer. And so the tradition endured, carried forward not by all monasteries, but by a stubborn few. Today, when you hear of Trappist beer or abbey ale, you are hearing echoes of this long story. The monks are fewer now, their cloisters smaller, but the brewing continues. It is strange to think a modern glass of dark Belgian ale is linked, thread by thread, to a monk in the 9th or 10th century, to hands stirring a wooden paddle in a steaming vat, to a cloister where silence reigned, broken only by the bubbling of fermenting wort. Beer is no longer a necessity. We drink it for pleasure, not survival. Water is clean now for most of us. But the memory remains in the glass, the memory of monks who brewed not to chase pleasure, but to sustain life. So, how did monks get drunk? Slowly, patiently, with moderation written into their very rules. But they did drink, and more than drink, they brewed. They brewed through famine and feast, through fasts and festivals. They brewed for themselves, for their neighbors, for strangers who knocked on the monastery gate. And in doing so, they carry brewing into the modern world. It is a curious thought that some of the most disciplined, silent, prayerful men of the Middle Ages were also men of beer. That devotion and drink were not opposites, but companions. That holiness could sit quietly beside a foaming mug. Tonight, if you sip a beer, you might think of them, of the cloisters, the kettles, the smell of malt in cold morning air, of monks who lifted mugs not for merriment, but for nourishment, of monks who got drunk not wildly, not foolishly, but gently. And with that, our story rests. Like a barrel sealed and left to ferment, it lingers quietly in the dark, waiting for the next time someone opens it and takes a slow, thoughtful sip. Good night.